He stopped explaining himself, and that was the moment they started calling him cold. Not because he had become cruel, not because he had lost his soul, not because he woke up one morning and decided to become impossible to love. They called him cold because the version of him they could control had finally died. Look closely at a man like that. He does not move like someone searching for peace. He moves like someone who survived the price of wanting peace too badly. His eyes are calm now, but not empty. His silence is heavy, but not weak. He does not rush to correct every lie. He does not chase every person who walks away. He does not bleed in public just to prove that he still has a heart. That is what makes people nervous. They were comfortable when his pain made him explain. They were comfortable when his loyalty made him stay. They were comfortable when his fear of being misunderstood made him easy to pull back into old rooms. But something changed. He became quiet in a different way. Not the silence of a man with nothing to say. The silence of a man who has learned that words can become weapons in the wrong hands. And if you have ever reached a point where you stop defending yourself, not because the accusation was true, but because the audience was unworthy, then you already understand the first piece of this story. They will not fear your anger as much as they fear your restraint. Anger still means they can move you. Reaction still means they can reach you. Explanation still means some part of you wants their judgment reversed. But silence? Silence says the door may already be closed. This is where Machiavelli begins. Not in cruelty, not in violence, not in the childish fantasy of becoming feared by everyone. Machiavelli begins where innocence ends. He begins at the moment a man realizes the world does not always reward goodness. It studies goodness. It tests it. It measures how far kindness can be pushed before it becomes self-betrayal. And this man had been tested. He had been tested by people who wanted his patience but not his truth, by people who wanted his loyalty but not his boundaries, by people who called him difficult only after he stopped being convenient. At first, he thought peace was the answer, so he became softer, more understanding, more forgiving, more willing to carry the emotional weight other people refused to carry. He believed that if he was patient enough, they would see his value. If he was kind enough, they would respect his heart. If he stayed calm enough, life would finally stop demanding that he fight for the dignity he had already earned. But peace did not protect him. It only made him easier to approach without consequence. That was the first betrayal, not from a person, from an idea. The idea that a man can remain harmless in a world full of hidden motives and still expect to be treated with honor. That idea had to die, because peace without strength is not peace. It is permission. Permission for disrespect to return wearing a softer voice. Permission for selfish people to call themselves wounded when they lose access. Permission for manipulators to accuse you of cruelty the moment you stop carrying their guilt. And once he saw that, the old peace began to rot in his hands. He could no longer worship it. He could no longer pretend that every conflict was a failure. Some conflicts were warnings, some were mirrors, some were the universe forcing him to see what politeness had helped him avoid. The world had not been trying to make him comfortable. It had been trying to make him accurate. That is why conflict found him again and again. Through betrayal, through rejection, through silence, through humiliation, through the sudden absence of people who once promised permanence. Each wound asked him the same question. Will you become bitter, or will you become precise? Most men choose bitterness because bitterness is easier than clarity. Bitterness lets you blame the world while avoiding the parts of yourself that gave the world too much access. But clarity is different. Clarity asks a harder thing. It asks you to look not only at who betrayed you, but at why you kept giving them the map. And that is where his real transformation began. He did not become steel because life hurt him. Many men get hurt and remain soft in the wrong places. Many men get betrayed and turn loud, suspicious, reactive, emotionally childish. They call it strength, but it is only pain trying to look powerful. He became steel because he studied the fire. He studied what each betrayal revealed. He studied what each loss removed. He studied what each humiliation exposed inside him. The man they now call cold is not empty. He is disciplined. He has learned that not every person deserves his warmth. Not every room deserves his truth. Not every conflict deserves his voice. Not every apology deserves his return. This is not hatred. This is order. And order is the beginning of power. So when they say he changed, they are not wrong. He did change. But they confuse the meaning of that change. He did not become someone worse. He became someone less available to the things that once weakened him. He stopped giving his heart to people who treated access like ownership. He stopped explaining his soul to people who only wanted control. He stopped chasing peace in places where peace required his disappearance. That is why he was never meant for peace, not real peace, fake peace. The peace of shrinking, the peace of swallowing, the peace of smiling while something inside him was being slowly erased. Conflict turned him into steel because conflict did what comfort could never do. It introduced him to himself without the costume. And once a man has met himself in the fire, he cannot go back to being shaped by soft hands. Tempered, not broken. Remember that phrase, because before this story ends, it will no longer sound like a sentence. It will sound like a verdict. They taught him to fear conflict before they taught him to understand it. That was not an accident. A man who fears conflict can be managed by anyone willing to create emotional pressure. He can be moved by disappointment, controlled by guilt, trapped by silence, redirected by the threat of being called selfish, arrogant, difficult, or changed. So they told him peace was always noble. Be patient, be humble, be the bigger man, let it go, do not make things worse, do not become like them. And sometimes those words were wise, but sometimes they were poison dressed as virtue. Because there is a kind of peace that heals, and there is a kind of peace that keeps a man obedient. The dangerous part is that both look calm from the outside. A man can be silent because he has mastered himself, or he can be silent because he is afraid of losing someone. A man can forgive because he is free, or he can forgive because he does not know how to leave. A man can keep the peace because the situation is beneath him, or he can keep the peace because deep down he believes his dignity is negotiable. That distinction changed everything. For years, he thought his restraint proved his strength, but restraint without boundary becomes a cage. Forgiveness without consequence becomes permission. Patience without self-respect becomes slow self-erasure. And this is what the world rarely tells a man. Some people do not love your peace. They love what your peace allows. They love that you do not confront. They love that you carry discomfort for them. They love that you will explain for an hour before walking away. They love that your fear of being misunderstood makes you return to the table after they have already shown you what they are. They do not fear losing you. They fear losing the version of you that made their behavior affordable. That is why the moment he changed, they called it betrayal. They said he was different now. They said he had become hard. They said he was no longer the same person. But hidden underneath their accusation was a confession. They were not grieving his heart. They were grieving their access. This is a truth that divides people. Some will hear it and call it bitter. Others will hear it and finally understand why certain people only respected them after distance made access uncertain. The man in this story began to understand that peace was never neutral. Every peace has a price. The question is who pays it. In his old life, he paid for peace with pieces of himself. He paid with swallowed anger, with unanswered disrespect, with loyalty given to people who treated loyalty like a resource they could withdraw from at any time. And the worst part was that he called this maturity. That is how the chain works. It teaches a man to rename his fear as wisdom. He says, I am just avoiding drama, when he is really avoiding confrontation. He says, I do not care anymore, when he is really afraid to admit he still does. He says, I am being patient, when he is really waiting for someone else to become honest so he does not have to make the decision himself. Machiavelli would have seen through that immediately. Power is not built on what people claim to be. It is built on what they consistently do when desire, fear, advantage, and consequence enter the room. A man who ignores that will keep being surprised by human nature. He will be shocked when kindness is exploited, shocked when loyalty is used, shocked when the person who asked for peace was the same person quietly starting the war. But the man being forged stops being shocked. He starts paying attention. He begins to notice who benefits from his silence. He notices who becomes uncomfortable when he names the obvious. He notices who calls him harsh only when the truth threatens their version of events. This is where his perception changes. Before, he wanted to be fair. Now, he wants to be accurate. Fairness without accuracy can become weakness. It can make a man give equal weight to truth and manipulation, loyalty and performance, apology and strategy. Accuracy is colder. Accuracy asks, what happened repeatedly? Who gained from my patience? What pattern did I keep excusing because I wanted the ending to be different? Those questions made him dangerous. Not violent, dangerous to illusion, dangerous to people who survived by keeping him emotionally confused. Because once a man becomes accurate, guilt loses some of its power. Flattery loses some of its shine. Apologies begin to require evidence. Promises begin to sound cheaper than patterns. That is when fake peace loses its throne. He no longer bends every time someone says, "You are overreacting." He no longer returns just because someone says, "I miss you." He no longer lowers his boundary just because someone calls the boundary cruel. He understands now that some people use moral language to protect selfish access. They say, "Forgive," when they mean, "Remove the consequence." They say, "Communicate," when they mean, "Let me negotiate your boundary down." They say, "You changed," when they mean, "You are harder to use now." This does not mean everyone is evil. That would be too simple. The deeper truth is worse. Many people do not need to be evil to be dangerous. They only need to be unconscious of how much they benefit from your lack of self-command. That is why he stopped giving himself away so cheaply. His attention became measured. His forgiveness became slower. His presence became conditional on respect. And people noticed. They always notice when the old source of comfort develops a locked door. At first, they test the handle. A joke, a guilt trip, a delayed reply, a soft apology without changed behavior. A sudden attempt to make him remember who he used to be, but he remembers too well. That is why he does not go back. The old peace required him to abandon himself. The new peace requires him to abandon the people who only loved him when he was easier to bend. That is the cost. And that is why conflict was necessary. Without conflict, he might have remained a polite prisoner forever. He might have kept calling his cage a virtue. He might have lived and died as a man praised for patience by the very people who profited from it. But conflict interrupted the lie. It made him uncomfortable enough to wake up. And once he woke up, peace could no longer be his master. Tempered, not broken. The chain did not survive the fire. Conflict is brutal because it does not care about the story you preferred. It does not care that you meant well. It does not care that you trusted them. It does not care that you were trying to be good, loyal, patient, or understood. Conflict strips away the decoration. It shows you what remains when words fail, promises collapse, and people are forced to choose between their image and their nature. That is why conflict became his teacher, not because it was kind, because it was honest. It taught him through people who smiled while measuring him. It taught him through love that became distant the moment he stopped overgiving. It taught him through friends who were comfortable with his struggle, but strangely uneasy with his discipline. Every lesson cost something, but each one revealed a pattern. He learned that not everyone who listens is loyal. Some people listen only to collect the weak points they will later press. He learned that not everyone who misses you values you. Some only miss the role you played in stabilizing their own chaos. He learned that not every apology is remorse. Some apologies are only attempts to regain access without transformation. These lessons did not make him cynical. They made him slower. And slowness is one of the first signs of power. A reactive man answers before he understands. A hungry man accepts before he evaluates. A wounded man returns before he examines whether anything has actually changed. But a tempered man waits. He watches the pattern after the apology. He watches the behavior after the promise. He watches what people do when his boundary is no longer negotiable. That is where truth appears. Not in the emotional peak, in the pattern after it. This is the part most men miss because they are addicted to the moment. A soft message, a sudden return, a dramatic confession, a flattering opportunity, a person from the past saying the words they once refused to say. But conflict taught him that intensity is not evidence. Patterns are evidence. And when he began to respect patterns more than feelings, he became harder to deceive. That was one of the hammer blows. Another came when conflict forced him to see himself. Because every betrayal exposes two things: the person who betrayed you and the part of you that wanted so badly to believe they would not. That second exposure hurts more. It is easier to call someone disloyal than to admit you ignored the first small sign. It is easier to hate the person who left than to admit you had been building your identity around their staying. But steel is not made by easy admissions. It is made when a man stops lying to himself. He had to admit that some of his pain came from misplaced trust. Some came from overexposure. Some came from giving sacred access to people who had shown no evidence of sacred character. That admission did not excuse them. It freed him. Because if everything was only their fault, he would remain trapped in what they did. But if some part of the lesson belonged to him, then his future could change. That is the difference between victimhood and power. Victimhood says, "Look what they did to me." Power says, "Look what I will never allow again." That shift changed his posture. He stopped waiting for closure from people who benefited from leaving him open. He stopped needing a confession from people who had already revealed themselves through action. He stopped asking the wrong people to validate the pain they caused. He learned to close the door without their permission. That is a dangerous moment in a man's life. The moment he realizes he does not need the person who wounded him to agree that the wound was real. Many people never reach that moment. They stay emotionally tied to the offender through the need to be understood. They call it healing, but it is still dependence. They are still waiting for the person who broke clarity to provide clarity. He stopped waiting. And in that waiting room, a part of him died. The part that believed every ending required explanation. The part that believed being misunderstood was unbearable. The part that believed love had to be proven by staying long after respect had disappeared. Conflict had shown him something deeper than betrayal. It showed him his addiction to being chosen. That was the wound beneath the wound, not the person who left, not the friend who betrayed, not the room that rejected him. The deeper wound was the fear that if they did not choose him, something about him was incomplete. Once he saw that, the game changed. Because a man who needs to be chosen can be controlled by anyone willing to withhold choice. A woman can control him with distance. A friend can control him with approval. A boss can control him with recognition. A crowd can control him with attention. He had been calling it desire, but sometimes it was hunger. And hunger makes men careless. It makes them reveal too much, accept too little, return too quickly, negotiate with disrespect, confuse emotional contrast with depth, mistake uncertainty for passion. Conflict taught him to recognize that hunger, not to shame it, to govern it. That is what Machiavelli understood about power at the deepest level. Before a man rules anything outside himself, he must rule the part of him that begs, reacts, performs, chases, and collapses when the world withholds what he wants. Self-command is the first kingdom. Without it, every external victory is unstable. So he began to practice small forms of command. He did not answer every provocation. He did not explain every silence. He did not announce every plan. He did not return to every familiar door just because loneliness knocked from inside him. These were not dramatic acts, but they were decisive. Because every time he refused to obey the old hunger, steel formed. Not in public, in private. In the internal moment when no one clapped, no one noticed, and no one rewarded him for choosing dignity over the familiar. This is why conflict is a teacher most men resent. It does not only teach you about others, it reveals where you are still for sale to approval, for sale to desire, for sale to memory, for sale to the fantasy that this time the pattern will become different because you want it badly enough. He had sold himself before, not knowingly, but through need. Now he was buying himself back, one silence at a time, one boundary at a time, one refusal at a time, one unreturned message at a time. And the more he reclaimed himself, the less the old world recognized him. That is how he knew it was working. Conflict had become the teacher. But the lesson was not complete until the fire removed what the teacher had exposed. The fire did not make him stronger by adding something new. It made him stronger by removing what could be used against him. This is where most men misunderstand transformation. They think becoming powerful means becoming louder, colder, richer, more admired, more feared, more visibly untouchable. But real power often looks like subtraction, less explaining, less access, less emotional leakage, less need to be seen by people who never had the depth to recognize him. The fire began by burning away his old availability. He had once believed that being open made him honest. But openness without discernment is not honesty, it is exposure. He had once believed that sharing his pain would create intimacy, but pain shared with the wrong person becomes a handle. He had once believed that announcing his ambition would prove his seriousness. But ambition spoken too early becomes a target for envy, doubt, and quiet sabotage. So he learned the mask, not the mask of a fraud, the mask of a man who finally understands that the inner world is not public property. That is the difference. A liar hides truth to manipulate others. A disciplined man guards truth to protect what has not yet become strong enough to survive careless hands. He no longer allowed his face to report every storm inside him. He no longer allowed his anger to become entertainment. He no longer allowed his plans to become conversation for people who had contributed nothing to their creation. When he was hurt, he became still. When he was angry, he became measured. When he was building, he became quiet. When he was leaving, he did not perform the exit. That frightened people, because people can fight anger. They can argue with words, they can negotiate with emotion, but stillness gives them nothing to grab. And every person who was used to grabbing something from him felt the difference. They tested him. Some tried guilt, some tried nostalgia, some tried affection, some tried disrespect disguised as a joke, but the handle was gone. This is why the mask became his first weapon, not because it attacked, because it denied access. And denial of access is one of the most underestimated forms of power. The world cannot easily control what it cannot read. It cannot easily wound what it cannot locate. It cannot easily sabotage what it does not know is being built. This is not paranoia. It is perception. A man does not need to hate the world to stop giving the world everything. He only needs to understand human nature. People are not always moved by justice. They are moved by insecurity, hunger, envy, fear, attraction, advantage, and the desire to remain important inside their own story. If your growth threatens that story, they may resist it while still claiming to love you. That is why the fire also burned away his need to be understood. This was one of the hardest removals, because there is a secret pleasure in being understood. It makes a man feel real, seen, confirmed, less alone inside his own skin. But the need to be understood can become another chain. It can make him over-explain to people committed to distortion. It can make him return to conversations that only reopen the wound. It can make him offer evidence to judges who already wrote the sentence. So he stopped. Not everyone deserves the full record. Some people deserve only the result of your decision. That sentence changed his life. He did not need to prove why he became distant. He did not need to document every wound. He did not need to convince someone that his boundary was reasonable. The boundary was the message, and if they needed a long explanation before respecting it, they had already revealed why the boundary was necessary. This is the point where the story becomes sharper than the opponent's version. Because steel is not just hardness. Steel is governed hardness. A man who becomes cold everywhere has not mastered power. He has only built a prison and called it protection. The fire had to teach him something more precise. Who deserves the mask? Who deserves the warmth? Who deserves silence? Who deserves the truth? Without that discernment, his strength would become another wound. He saw men like that. Men who had been hurt and now called every woman dangerous. Men who had been betrayed and now called every friendship fake. Men who had been humiliated and now wore arrogance as a bandage over shame. They looked strong, but they were still controlled by the past. He refused that path. He did not want to become a monument to what hurt him. He wanted to become free from it. So the fire removed not only his softness, but also his pride. It removed the need to appear unbothered when he was still learning. It removed the need to punish everyone for the sins of a few. It removed the temptation to confuse emotional numbness with mastery. This was the perception break. Conflict did not turn him into steel so he could feel nothing. It turned him into steel so he could feel deeply without losing form. That is real discipline. To love without dissolving. To desire without begging. To be angry without becoming reckless. To be silent without becoming afraid. To be guarded without becoming dead. This is why the old self could not survive. The old self lived by reaction. It chased what withdrew. It explained when accused. It apologized when uncomfortable. It returned when lonely. It mistook emotional intensity for meaning because quiet stability felt unfamiliar. The fire exposed all of that, and once exposed, it had to burn, not because the old self was evil, because it was unfit for the life ahead. A man cannot carry a crown with the posture of a beggar. He cannot build sovereignty with habits designed for approval. He cannot become steel while protecting the parts of himself that still want to be shaped by every hand that touches him. So the fire did its work. It burned away the need to be liked. It burned away the addiction to access. It burned away the fantasy that peace would come from being chosen by the right people. And in the ashes, something quieter stood, not loud enough to impress the crowd, strong enough to no longer need the crowd, tempered, not broken. By now, the phrase should feel heavier, Because the fire had not simply hurt him, it had taken away every part of him that kept volunteering for pain. There is a death that happens before a man becomes powerful. It is not seen by the world. No funeral, no announcement, no applause, no final speech, where everyone finally understands what he survived. It happens quietly, when he realizes the person he has been can no longer carry the person he is becoming. That is when the old self begins to die. And the old self does not die easily. It returns through memory, through guilt, through loneliness, through the sudden warmth of someone who once made him bleed, through the seductive thought that maybe this time, if he explains better, loves harder, stays calmer, or gives more, the ending will change. That is how the old self begs for survival. It does not always sound weak. Sometimes it sounds moral. Be kind. Do not be harsh. Give them another chance. Maybe you are overreacting. Maybe peace is more important than pride. But he had learned the difference now. Not every chance is mercy. Some chances are self-betrayal, repeated with softer language. Not every return is love. Some returns are fear of emptiness. Not every peace is wisdom. Some peace is the old cage asking to be called home. This is why the old self had to die. The old self was not useless. It had carried him through years when he did not know better. It helped him survive rooms where honesty was punished. It helped him adapt to people whose moods controlled the air. It taught him how to read tension before tension became danger. But what helps a man survive one season can imprison him in the next. The habit of pleasing may protect a boy. It can destroy a man. The habit of over-explaining may reduce conflict in the short term. It can train the world to put him on trial forever. The habit of forgiving too quickly may keep people close. It can also keep the wrong people close enough to keep wounding him. So he stopped romanticizing the old self. He honored it, then he buried it. This is a painful stage, because a man does not only lose people when he changes, he loses the version of himself that knew how to belong with them. That is the hidden grief. He may leave the relationship, but he also leaves the identity that was built around being needed. He may outgrow the friendship, but he also outgrows the language of shared complaints. He may walk away from the room, but he also walks away from the smaller performance that room once rewarded. Transformation is not addition, it is amputation. And the cut is real. He had to cut away the man who still wanted the apology, the man who wanted the final conversation, the man who wanted the people who doubted him to one day admit they were wrong. That man was still bargaining with the past, and the past is a ruthless negotiator. It offers memory as proof. It offers nostalgia as evidence. It offers a few beautiful moments to make a destructive pattern look complicated. But a pattern does not become harmless because it had beautiful moments. That line alone will divide people. Some will hate it because it removes the romance from their excuses. Others will feel a door open because they finally understand why the good moments kept them trapped longer than the bad ones. He understood it now. The old self had used memory against him. It kept replaying the warmth and editing out the cost. It kept asking him to consider their pain while forgetting his own. It kept presenting endurance as love, because leaving would require him to face the silence afterward. But the new man would not be governed by edited memories. He chose the whole truth. And the whole truth was not always flattering. He had stayed too long. He had explained too much. He had made idols out of people who only deserved observation. He had given sacred access to ordinary character. That admission hurt, but it also returned his power, because once he saw his own role, he was no longer trapped waiting for the world to change. He could change the gate. He could change the price of access. He could change the part of himself that kept confusing intensity with intimacy. This is where detachment entered, not as coldness, as freedom from emotional ownership. He could want without kneeling. He could care without becoming captive. He could love without surrendering his center. He could lose without turning loss into an identity. Detachment did not remove his heart. It removed the leash. That is why it frightened people. A detached man cannot be easily punished with distance. He cannot be bribed with inconsistent affection. He cannot be ruled by the promise of future respect from people who refuse to show present respect. He still feels. But feeling no longer gives the world a throne inside him. This is the philosophical core of the story. A man becomes steel when life can strike him without reshaping his identity. Not when he stops hurting. Not when he stops caring. Not when he becomes a machine. But when hurt no longer makes him abandon himself. That is the death of the old self. The old self needed approval to feel real. The new self uses approval as information, not oxygen. The old self chased love until it forgot dignity. The new self understands that love without dignity becomes dependency. The old self feared enemies because enemies meant rejection. The new self understands that the right enemies are proof that his boundaries finally have teeth. And with that, another part of the world changed around him. Some people became distant. Some became offended. Some tried to pull the old man back out of him. They poked. They tested. They sent familiar signals. They waited for the old reaction. But the old reaction did not come. That is when they realized he was not pretending. The old man was dead, and the new man did not owe them access to the grave. This is the loneliness of becoming, not the loneliness of being unwanted. The loneliness of no longer being compatible with the places that once recognized your weakness as personality. He carried that loneliness. Not because it was easy, because it was honest. The crown is heavy, but some weights are proof that a man has stopped crawling. Tempered, not broken. The old self died quietly. But the silence it left behind became a throne. By the end, he did not become untouchable. That would be a childish lie. He still felt pain. He still remembered names. He still had nights when silence felt heavier than noise. He still had moments when the old hunger rose inside him and asked for the familiar life back. But now, something was different. The pain could visit. It could not rule. That is the difference between a wounded man and a tempered man. A wounded man is controlled by what happened. A tempered man is informed by what happened. One keeps bleeding into every room. The other learns where the blade entered and never stands the same way again. This is where the story pays off. He was never meant for peace if peace meant shrinking. He was never meant for peace if peace meant calling fear maturity. He was never meant for peace if peace meant letting people keep their comfort while he paid the price in dignity. But he was meant for a harder peace. A peace built after conflict. A peace protected by boundaries. A peace that does not collapse the moment someone disapproves. That kind of peace is not given. It is taken back from every person, pattern, memory, and weakness that once claimed ownership over him. Machiavelli would understand this. Power is not only the ability to influence others. The first power is the ability to stop being moved by every hand that reaches for your hidden need. If they can move you with praise, they own your vanity. If they can move you with silence, they own your fear. If they can move you with affection, they own your hunger. If they can move you with guilt, they own your conscience before you do. So he learned to govern himself. Not perfectly, no man does, but more honestly than before. He learned that self-command is not a mood, it is a repeated decision. It is made in the small moments no one sees, when the message arrives and he does not answer from hunger, when the insult lands and he does not react for performance, when the opportunity appears and he does not sell his dignity for access, when loneliness visits and he does not reopen the door to the cage just because the cage is familiar. That is how steel remains steel, under pressure, not in comfort. Anyone can appear strong when nothing is testing them. The real measure comes when the old pattern returns with a new face and a softer voice. The same manipulation, but more polite. The same disrespect, but better hidden. The same false peace, but with a better excuse. This time, he sees it. That is his reward, not revenge. Perception. He can feel psychological tension in a room before it becomes open conflict. He can sense when someone is using uncertainty to keep him emotionally suspended. He can tell when absence is designed to create curiosity, and when absence simply reveals indifference. He reads the room because he no longer begs the room to read him kindly. That is power, quiet power, the kind that does not need theater, and this is where enemies lose their old meaning. He no longer fears being disliked by people who require his smallness. He no longer mistakes criticism for truth just because it is loud. He no longer thinks every closed door is a verdict. Some closed doors are protection. Some enemies are confirmation. Some loneliness is not abandonment, but selection. This is why he does not bend back. The cage may call him again. It may sound like nostalgia. It may sound like love. It may sound like unfinished business. It may sound like the old promise that if he just becomes softer, everyone can be comfortable again. But he knows the cost now. He knows that the cage never returns as a cage. It returns as memory. It returns as a familiar voice. It returns as the beautiful part of the pattern, carefully separated from the destruction that came after it. But steel remembers the fire, not with bitterness, with accuracy. He remembers what it cost to become himself. He remembers the nights he almost went back. He remembers the old self bargaining, pleading, dressing fear in moral language. And because he remembers, he remains. This is the final transformation. He does not hate peace. He has simply stopped accepting counterfeit peace. He does not hate love. He has simply stopped calling dependency love. He does not hate people. He has simply stopped giving every person the same access to the parts of him that took fire to rebuild. The man standing at the end of this story is not cruel. He is clear. He is not empty. He is governed. He is not broken. He is tempered. And that clarity changes how he walks through the world. He can be kind without being available. He can be calm without being passive. He can be silent without being afraid. He can be loving without being owned. That is the steel, not hardness alone. Form. A man with form cannot be shaped by every mood, accusation, invitation, or absence. He may feel them, he may consider them, but he does not become them. This is what conflict gave him. It gave him the one thing comfort could never provide, a self that could survive reality. So if this story reaches a man sitting somewhere in silence, feeling the strange distance between who he was and who he is becoming, let him understand this clearly. The conflict was not meaningless. The betrayal was not permission to become cruel. The loneliness was not proof that he was unworthy. The rejection was not the final sentence. The fire was not only destruction, it was a forge. But the forge does not decide what you become. It only reveals what cannot survive and what refuses to die. A man must still choose. He can become bitter, or he can become precise. He can become numb, or he can become disciplined. He can become proud, or he can become sovereign. He can use the mask to hide forever, or he can use it to protect what is valuable until the right people earn the truth. That choice is where the real man is made, not in the wound, in the interpretation of the wound, not in the fire, in what remains after the fire is done. And now the final truth stands without needing decoration. He was never meant for peace if peace meant surrender. He was never meant for peace if peace meant staying harmless for people who only respected harm. He was never meant for peace if peace meant returning to the shape of the cage that once held him. He was meant for the harder road, the road where silence becomes command, where absence becomes clarity, where enemies become evidence, where loneliness becomes a wage, where the old self is buried without applause. He was not made cruel by conflict. He was made clear. He was not made empty. He was made controlled. He was not made broken. He was made steel, tempered, not broken. And if this story helped you see conflict differently, don't just leave with the lesson. Subscribe to Shadow Mind, because every week we break down the hidden psychology, silent power, and Machiavellian truths that shape the man you become. Like the video if you want more real power psychology, and subscribe now so you don't miss the next breakdown. Disclaimer: this content is for entertainment and educational, informational purposes only, and is not financial, medical, or psychological advice. Steel does not return to the cage.